I worked in the library at St John's for 12 years. And my interest in this is because an ancestor of mine was John Stokoe, who was one of Napoleon's surgeons.
Great, absolutely great. That's fantastic. You made me a very happy man. You made me a very happy man.
It'll make me very happy if you could provide any information about that. It would be great.
I was hoping you might be able to provide me with some information, because in
one moment, I've got the book. I've got his book here. I'm just going to get it.
Yeah. No, I know the book. Yeah. I have a very interesting remark about that, Alan. The English version of Stokoe's memoirs were reverse engineered from the French. It's an insane story. Basically, Stokoe's granddaughter ended up with his memoirs, whole load of pages, and he was apparently very verbose. And so a French scholar took Stokoe's memoirs and compressed them and made them into a story, sometimes quoting from them, but sometimes not. This having been then done, Stokoe's granddaughter, who had received the original manuscripts, had the French text translated into English, not Stokoe's memoirs.
Oh, I see.
Almost insane story. The English version of Stokoe's memoirs has more documents in it than the French version. So some of the documents that were left on the floor for the French copy were included in the English copy a few years later. So Stokoe's memoirs are the one, I think, would be fantastic, extraordinarily interesting to find. But and I was hoping that you would be able to tell me where they were.
No. I have contacted members of my family. My cousin has a signed photograph, signed portrait, which is the one that's used in the frontispiece of the book. Right, my cousin has the original. I've been trying to see if he would let me have it, but he won't. Okay. Yes.
Stokoe's story touches me particularly because I'm from the northeast of England, and Stokoe was from County Durham, and he ended his life indeed in the north. And I discovered via a Napoleon enthusiast who was also a shipping magnate from Newcastle, had a big Napoleonic collection, wrote a little paper about Stokoe. He also gave me the tiny little nugget of information that Stokoe was known to his local friends as Napoleon Stokoe. Yeah, because he was a big. He worked for Napoleon's brother. When he was expelled and cashiered from the Navy, he then became full-on Bonapartist and spent a lot of time in Philadelphia working for Joseph Bonaparte.
I didn't know that.
Knew his daughter extremely well and remained in very good terms with Joseph Bonaparte up till Joseph's death in 1845. Oh, right. And so Stokoe, his granddaughter, again published some of his medical records in the Lancet, again taking stuff from his memoirs, but it's just medical stuff. It's not the history of what it was like to be with Joseph in Philadelphia, which I would be very, very, very interested in.
Yes.
So if any of your family could point me to,
I will contact them shortly after this.
I don't care how verbose he was; it would be fantastic to see.
My family are from South Shields.
Oh, right, okay.
Right, and my grandfather, who I'm named after, was a bit of a bad lad. He actually owned a factory which manufactured mica grease bearings for the shipbuilding, for the rolling when they were launched, for the rolling platforms. So but he he embezzled the company and was sent away from my grandmother and her brother, who was a naval surgeon, So we're from a naval family of naval surgeons. It's incredible.
Right.
My great uncle Britain was a naval surgeon, and they deported him, if you like, to Australia.
Okay.
And I know a bit about that. And the other great thing, although it's not interesting to you, is that he was a very, very, very good golfer, and I'm named after him, and that's my hobby. Okay. So there we go. But anyway, that's by the by.
Listen,
this
Alan,
is much more interesting.
I would really love to have your email address, and I'll communicate with you about Stokoe.
Absolutely, we'll give you.
Delighted.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I will send it through the chat facility. I will send you my email address.
Thank you.
That would be great to have some correspondence with you.
Splendid. That'd be lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, great to have some correspondence with you.
Splendid. That'd be lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Terry, we have about 23 people already signed up. We have 40 registered, so we could have some more to come, but we're after 7.
It's around 8 o'clock. I think we should probably start.
Was it the G7 summit? Was it?
So, Peter,
holiday makers.
welcome to Cambridge Society. Now, I have to say, at about 8 o'clock or before 8 o'clock, my eldest Paris grandson's going to come by because he's just in the middle of taking his French back next door, and he's coming right around to see us. He's interested. He may well sit in for the end of your lecture, but we're planning to take him out to dinner afterwards. So we shall probably have to leave soon after 8 o'clock. But that's a bit of information I give you now. So, Peter, Napoleon, the flavour of the month. Over to you to tell us all about it.
Thank you very much, Terry. I will be sharing my screen in a while to show you some lovely photographs of the people I'm about to talk about. I should present myself. I'm a historian and manager of international affairs at a French non-profit organization, which is called the Fondation Napoléon. I have been working there for the last 20 years, and I have, through most of that time, been working on Napoleon I, though I do occasionally talk about Napoleon III. Our mission statement is we encourage and support interest and study in Napoleon I and Napoleon III. Obviously, 1821, 1815 was of major importance in the history of Napoleon, this period of Napoleon's exile on St Helena. And this is what I'm proposing to talk to you this evening, and some of my research scoops, some of my recent discoveries, which I will be publishing at the end of the year in a book in French. 1921 was the centenary of Napoleon's death, and in the world of publishing, and notably in the newspapers, not just the whole year, but also the period from 1915 through to 1921 was a huge year of publications about Napoleon. And many of these publications were in English. At that time, it was the Napoleonic episode on St Helena, 1815 to 1821, was seized upon by 2 or 3 major historians of St Helena, and they've occupied the terrain ever since. A man called Chaplin wrote the very fundamental book, which everybody who wants to study Napoleon on St Helena uses, called Who's Who on St Helena, published several times in the decade between 1910 and 1919. And then Norwood Young, who had already written on Napoleon on Elba, then went on to publish 2 volumes of Napoleon on St Helena. A man called Watson also published an extremely detailed and excellent study of a Polish character who wanted to follow Napoleon to St Helena and was finally allowed to, a man called Pionkowski. So these are the sort of books that set up the study of Napoleon on St Helena in English. The memoirs, of course, the great memoirs of Napoleon on St Helena, the men that Heine would call in 1827, I'm sorry, he would call the evangelists of St Helena. They were notably Las Cases and Barry O'Mara, two other figures who were subsequently not read at all. But Barry O'Mara, Napoleon's doctor, and Las Cases, Napoleon's secretary, they published almost barely 2 years after the death of Napoleon in 1823, they both published memoirs of conversations with Napoleon on St Helena. Las Cases published his conversations for the year of 1816 because he was expelled from the island at the end of that year. And Barry O'Mara, Napoleon's Irish doctor, who started working for Napoleon when he was going into exile on one of the boats that he handed himself over to, the Bellerophon. He wrote for the period 1815, 1816 through to 1818, when he likewise was expelled from the island for being a little bit too friendly with the French. Now, my presentation this evening is going to be talking about 5 or 6 different figures whose memoirs were not published at the time and have not been published since, or notably have not appeared in French. So I'm looking at a particular, got my French spectacles on this evening. Napoleon, oddly enough, he was hugely popular amongst British people, notably at the time when he handed himself over. This was in July of 1815. Napoleon, the great, the sort of the man who the British government had wanted to portray as the devil incarnate, the man who was going to come and eat your children. By the time he had handed himself over to the British, he was appearing in Torbay Bay in late July 1815, thousands of people were flocking the ship in which he was to get a glimpse of the extraordinary figure of the epoch. He was clearly a man who marked everybody's spirits. People were traveling down on special trains to get a boat to go out to try and see the great man. The sailors of Bellerophon, they adopted a system where they had a little sort of blackboard which they'd hang over the side of the boat, which said, "Napoleon is having his dinner. Napoleon is walking around on the deck," just so that the people in the little boats around Bellerophon could, if they couldn't see Napoleon, at least they get an idea of what he was doing. So Napoleon has huge interest. And so when he is finally taken to St Helena, the interest doesn't die. People are absolutely fascinated by any sort of information they can get of Napoleon, what he's doing, what the captivity is like. Napoleon himself is also very interested in communicating this information because he keeps open communication with Europe, because his policy, his idea is to be finally repatriated. He's hoping that his captivity on St Helena is going to be temporary, and he hopes this until 1818 with the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle. Finally, the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle confirms the decision of the Allies in 1815 to send Napoleon to St Helena, and at that point, Napoleon, to use a French expression, realizes his carrots are cooked, and he is going to stay on St Helena until he probably dies, which is what happens on the 5th of May, 1821. So what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to take you through these new discoveries of mine via the manuscripts that I've uncovered in various parts of the world. And what I think is particularly interesting indeed about this moment of Napoleon's life is that it's a European story. Now, lots of people, I mean, for 200 years, people have been writing about Napoleon on St Helena. So how is it at all possible for me now, in the last years, to be discovering new things about Napoleon on St Helena? Well, I think the simple explanation is because I've been living for the past 20 years and working on Napoleon in France. I speak fluent French, but I'm also English, and I'm an English historian. So when you sit yourself over these two research worlds, French and English, the pictures that emerge are different from the ones that my French colleagues get, and the pictures are different from the ones that my British colleagues get. Historians of Napoleon on St Helena tend to be, in Britain, tend to be monolingual. Likewise for my colleagues in France, they tend not to be able to manipulate the historiography in English. So that has meant that in a rather extraordinary moment 10 years ago, I fell upon the original manuscript of Las Cases Mémorial de Sainte Hélène. Now, this manuscript was copied, seized from Las Cases on St Helena, copied in 1816, given to Lord Bathurst. Nobody in France knew it existed. People in England knew it existed in the 1920s, but nobody was particularly interested because the centenary period had finished. And when Lord Bathurst gave this manuscript, or rather loaned it to the British Library in the 1960s, French historians were unaware of it. We hadn't entered the bicentenary period, so Napoleon wasn't of particular interest. So basically the manuscript of Las Cases Mémorial was lying in plain view in open access at the British Library, unbeknownst to most French scholars. So I happened to be working on a subject in 2004 related to the governor of St Helena, writing an article. I was doing some research and I fell into the catalogue, and I said to my boss, Thierry Lentz, I said, did you know the original manuscript of Las Cases Mémorial is in London? And he said, no. And we both assumed that everybody knew this, and yet they didn't. So this was published after quite a long period of research, because largely this manuscript, being a loan manuscript, the British Library would not let us photograph it. So we had to go to London over several visits with 4 of my colleagues to transcribe it by hand. And so we published the version of Las Cases Mémorial, largely dictated by Napoleon, the version that Napoleon himself wanted to be published. So that was a bit of a scoop. So moving on from that sort of thing, I have carried on my research. I'd like to take you now to the first figure in my talk this evening, who is, I'm trying to move on, but there we go. William Henry, 3rd Baron Lyttelton of Franklin. Now, as I was saying, when Napoleon handed himself over to the British, he was first on a vessel called Bellerophon. And then before being taken to St Helena, he was transferred to a delightfully named Northumberland, a boat that, a much bigger boat, which would take him on the long transatlantic journey down to the island in the middle of the South Atlantic, St Helena. At this moment of the transshipment of Napoleon from Bellerophon to Northumberland, 2 figures were allowed to meet Napoleon. One of them is called Lord Lowther. He was from the Alien Office. Now, the Alien Office at that time was largely to do with espionage and information. And so the presence of Lord Lowther in an interview with Napoleon on board Northumberland is not entirely surprising. However, William Henry Lyttelton is perhaps more surprising. He had a special entry into Napoleon's presence because the admiral who was taking Napoleon to St Helena, Admiral Cockburn, was in fact a relation of his. So he gets a free pass onto the boat. And they have a conversation which lasts quite a long time. And Lowther and Lyttelton both write down their conversation. They talk about things, and they're fascinated by what Napoleon has to say. A nice quote from Lyttelton's manuscript goes like this: I should imagine it impossible not to admire his quickness, adroitness, and originality, and the excellent command of a temper that accompanied those spirited and agreeable qualities. We must, of course, be well aware that William Henry, 3rd Baron Lyttelton of Franklin, is, of course, a liberal. So he's quite interested in Napoleon as he sees Napoleon through liberal spectacles as the continuer of the French Revolution. Of course, the liberals in Britain at the time, the Whigs, were quite keen on the idea of the French Revolution and had used Napoleon throughout the period of 1800 to 1815 as a sort of stick with which to beat the right-wing characters in government at the time. Of course, it took liberals another 27 years finally to get into power after the Napoleonic episode was finished. And so this character, William Henry, who's a middling, he's a middle of the road liberal. Not a card. He's not like a Lord Byron. He's not as crazy, let's say, as the liberal leader at the time who cut his throat when Napoleon lost at Waterloo because he was so depressed. So he's not that extreme. He's not an extreme left-wing figure. He's a centrist, William Henry. And so his text on Napoleon is quite measured. As you see, from my quote, as I mentioned earlier, he's quite a fan. He thinks he's quite cool. Littleton's copies of his manuscript of this version that they hammered out, he and Lord Lowther, they went straight back to their hotel in Plymouth to write down what they thought, what they could remember of their conversation. Littleton and Lowther published sections of it in the British press, but not the complete thing. Just before he died in 1836, Littleton prepared for publication 52 private copies of this version of his conversation with Napoleon. This was published. It was finally sort of a version, a Bowdlerized sort of, what's the word, that they sort of changed some of the text to make it a little bit more negative about Napoleon. This was published later by his grandson, Littleton's grandson, and that version was translated into French. And then the final version, the original version of that Littleton himself had published as a private edition, was published in French in 1946, I think. So that version was known in France. However, a manuscript which Littleton himself had created in 1816 strangely survived, and it was found in Dresden, of all places. Now, Littleton was keen on European politics, and he was friends with the plenipotentiary in London, a man called Wilhelm von Just. And his papers were handed over to the archives in Dresden, where they were discovered by the librarian in the 1850s and published in a German translation. This document remained in Dresden until when a copy of it was sent to Paris. Now, in the 1860s, Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew, was currently trying to publish the complete correspondence of Napoleon I, and they had obviously asked the archive in Dresden, which had been an ally of Napoleon's during the Napoleonic period, Saxony. They sent all they had in terms of Napoleonic documents, copies of them, and amongst those, they sent the original English version of Littleton's account. And that then entered the Archives Nationales here in Paris. And when my institution, the Fondation Napoléon, began to publish the complete correspondence of Napoleon, the Archives Nationales sent that to us, and I found it in our library. So I found the original manuscript that Henry Littleton had made in 1816 and given to his mate, his Dresden mate, Wilhelm von Just. So the version I'm publishing in the new year, next year, will be the version that Littleton finally wrote himself. So slightly different from the version that Littleton himself published in 1836. So that's that account. I'd like to take you on now to the next person, Denzil Ibbotson. Now, Denzil Ibbotson was the Commissary General and purveyor to Napoleon's establishment at Longwood from 1818 to 1823. He's famous, if you know anything about the Napoleon episode on St Helena, he's famous for his sketches of Napoleon. This is one of them. There you can see a fantastic, almost caricature, but in a way, I think this is probably what they look like. Lovely picture of Gourgaud, General Gourgaud on the far left. Then we've got Bertrand with his receding hairline and bare pate, the emperor in the middle. Then that's Las Cases, who was very short, the oldest of all of Napoleon's companions. And to the far right, Flash Harry, the Comte de Maintenon. So there's a lovely sketch made by Ibbotson himself. There's another one which Ibbotson gave to Theodore Hook. We were talking just earlier with Alan Purvis about dodgy behavior and taking money from the company. Theodore Hook was caught taking money from Ile de France, Mauritius. He was governor of Mauritius, and he'd been caught with his hand in the till. And so he was taken back to, being taken back to London to have to explain himself. Theodore Hook was famous for being an author, a bit like Boris Johnson, really. He was very, he sort of had a career as a flyboy journalist. And so he was being taken home, and Denzil Ibbotson gave Theodore Hook this delightful image of Napoleon on board Northumberland on the way to St Helena. So why am I talking about Denzil Ibbotson? Well, Denzil Ibbotson, who was also known as Periwinkle, because he was a bit of a lovey. He liked the theatre, and he organised lots of plays for the local theatre on St Helena. The soldiers would come down and act in the different plays, and he organised all of that. He married a local, Martha Kay, and his little diary, a delightful little thing, a book about sort of so big, which he kept on board Northumberland, suddenly emerged in the sale of Ibbotson's papers in 2010 in New Zealand. So this document I have now transcribed and translated into French, because of course he wrote it in English. It has fascinating details about the swords that Napoleon had with him on the boat. For example, the sabre d'aboukir and the glaive du champ de mai. These are both famous swords that are now, one of them is in Châteauroux, which is where most of Bertrand's papers are. Bertrand, the Grand Marshal Bertrand, who was one of Napoleon's companions on St Helena, perhaps the most important one. And also the sabre d'aboukir, which I think is in Fontainebleau. So these are important arms, side arms that Napoleon had with him. There's also a slightly delightful and a little bit racy conversation. Napoleon, I think, being cheeky during dinner one evening on board Northumberland, wondered why the English word mistress could mean not just miss, but also a whore. And there's a sort of a moment of confusion around the dinner table as people try to explain or translate from French into English the word mistress, the word whore. And the Comte de Montholon's wife, who is also a bit racy, Ibbotson informs us that she says that a mistress was une dame too much comme ça, which is a delightful expression, I thought. And so you get an idea of right inside Napoleon's entourage, quite how the ladies would express themselves, and particularly a nice little moment of the Comtesse de Montholon being a little bit salacious. I think it's very interesting to get a picture of the women around Napoleon. We tend to be a bit monochrome about Napoleon. Napoleon as a lover, ladies being either mothers or lovers. Now, the women who accompany Napoleon to St Helena are obviously much more than that. And so these occasional moments of light on the character of the Comtesse de Montholon are, of course, extremely interesting. I'd like to take you on now to another lady who is, alas, I couldn't find a photograph of her. So I've got a photograph of her husband, Robert, young husband. Napoleon said, "Ah, que cet homme est superbe." And you can see from this little engraving, he is indeed superb. And another delightfully, he's from Northumberland as well. So we're sort of piling up the Northerners here. Catherine Younghusband. She is sort of typical of the figures who would find themselves on St Helena in the period between 1815 and 1821. She was one of 14 children. Most of her family are military people, and she ends up in India. Of course she does. And because the East India Company uses St Helena, it owns St Helena, and St Helena is taken from the East India Company by the British government during the period of Napoleon's captivity as a sort of special island that no longer really is part of the company. But the company ships come from both West and East India, and they stop at St Helena usually to refit or to bring stores or just to have a break from the huge voyage from, say, the big cities of India or the big shipyards of India as they go back up to Britain. Catherine Younghusband, her maiden name was Catherine Winyards, was one of 14 children. She was at Fort William, Kolkata, in East India, and she lost both of her parents in 1805 and married again at the age of 32 when she married the delightful Robert Young husband. She didn't have any children with him, but she did have children with her previous husband, Mr. Robertson, and the son, as is typical at the time, she left with people presumably either in England or in India, and she brought with her her daughter, who at that point was in her early, I think between 5, 6 or 7 or something like this, perhaps a little bit older. Catherine Young husband thinks of herself as a bit of a writer. She thinks of herself as quite cultured. She thinks of herself as a great musician. She speaks very good French, so she's well trained. She supposedly hangs out in the houses around where Napoleon is with the idea of meeting Napoleon. And of course, as luck would have it, she does in fact meet Napoleon at the Briars. When Napoleon lands in St Helena on the 15th of October, 1815, he is first lodged in a small house not far from Jamestown called the Briars. Now, she takes her daughter to go and play with the famous Betsy Balcom, who lives at the Briars, and of course meets Napoleon. She then writes home to her family and tells the story of how she meets Napoleon, what Napoleon asks her to do, the songs he wants her to sing. He teaches her how to pronounce Italian. She's invited to dinner. She becomes a bit of a friend of Napoleon's, and her letters back home are full of fascinating details about life inside Napoleon's house, the sort of details that most inhabitants of St Helena, and certainly not the most of the army on St Helena, because let's not forget there's a huge garrison once Napoleon is there of nearly 3,000 men. So she is inside the houses where Napoleon lives and has conversations with them, and she writes home to her family, and her letters are even published in the papers. Slightly disappointing because she didn't give permission for the letters, and Napoleon finds out because he's receiving the British newspapers, and it's a bit of a sort of disappointment to him that her letters to her family should be published. But nevertheless, it continues, keeps people talking about Napoleon, so it's not quite too bad in the end. She gives piano lessons to the Grand Marechal Bertrand's children, and she's introduced with the French because she speaks the language. What's particularly interesting is her accounts, of which originals we have are now held at the National Army Museum in Chelsea. We have the manuscript, so we can then see what she originally wrote, because her letters back home were finally published in a British publication, Blackwood's Magazine, in 1947. Now, whereas Catherine Young husband is happy to talk about Napoleon, the emperor, basically referring to him in terms which were illegal on St Helena. This thing that the governor of St Helena had said, we mustn't refer to Napoleon as emperor, we must refer to him as General Bonaparte, which caused a lot of confusion and frustration, not only for the French on St Helena, but also for English liberals. Many people wondered why there was an issue. Why couldn't he just be the fallen emperor? Of course, many kings and emperors have had that situation in the past, and nobody ever stopped calling them, whether that was Louis XVIII or whatever. So there was a bit of confusion as to why there was so much emphasis placed on not giving Napoleon the title emperor. Anyway, Catherine Young husband quite happily talks about Napoleon, Emperor Napoleon, all sorts of terms that would have made Hudson Lowe, the governor of St Helena, leap out of his chair. But when her letters were published by Blackwood's Magazine, the old battle of Napoleon between Napoleon and Hudson Lowe re-emerged, and Blackwood's Magazine bowdlerized her letters and changed them to make them fit the policy of the period 1815 to 1821, which of course nobody would think of doing these days when they come across an original manuscript. So my publication produces the original versions of Catherine Young husband's letters and her fascinating account of the emperor inside Longwood and at the Briars. I'd like to move on now to Lady Laura Buchan. I think it's very important, as I mentioned earlier, to get the female voice. It's very difficult often to find biographical details of women because they're not as frequently recorded as their husbands or So now that I have two clear figures of female figures who are recounting their experience of Napoleon, I think that's of particular importance these days. Anyway, Laura Wilkes was the daughter of this man, Mark Wilkes, Governor Mark Wilkes. Mark Wilkes was, again, a man from India. St Helena's contacts with India are quite strong. People would end up moving from St Helena and going to work in the British, in parts of for the company, because of course St Helena was a company island. They would end up working for the company in different parts of South India. Mark Wilkes was one of the first historians of South India, published 3 volumes of history of South India and the period of the changeover from the Mughals to the company control, which interestingly enough, the locals found that the company was a little bit nicer than the Mughals in the past. So there was a certain positivity towards the company, at least as far as Mark Wilkes tells the story of the company's taking over control of South India. Modern historians of India are a little bit, where they have differences of opinion, also depending on their political slant, as to quite how positive the local populations were to the company as opposed to the Mughals. But what I think is interesting is that certainly I think that it appears that during famines that often occurred in India, the company was much more interested in making sure that the locals survived as opposed to the Mughals, because they were working for the company. So there was a reason, the de facto, the company was a little bit more humane, if only for financial reasons. Mark Wilkes delightfully ends up having basically a sabbatical on St Helena. He retires to England on ill health, and then is given this 3-year basically sabbatical as governor of St Helena in 1812. So largely so he can finish his 3-volume history of South India. He takes with him his new wife, who is a lot younger than he is, and the most beautiful woman on St Helena, Lady Laura Buchan née Wilkes. She is, everybody falls in love with her because she's so amazingly beautiful on the island, notably Gaspard Gourgaud in the French, one of the French companions of Napoleon is particularly smitten, but he gets nowhere. Mark Wilkes finds out about Napoleon arriving on St Helena. This is because of the vagaries of communication with the island. It took boats between 2 to 3 months to get from London to St Helena. So Mark Wilkes finds out that Napoleon is about to land on his island 3 days before Napoleon lands on his island. So he must have been extremely shocked to find out that his island was no longer a part of the company, but was also to be sequestered by the British government as a prison island for Napoleon, with 3,000 troops occupying it. His subsequent his position as governor is sort of, he becomes a civil governor, but he has no real power. And the military figure, Admiral Cockburn, who is the admiral of the Northumberland that brings Napoleon out, he is in control. He's the military controller. And so Mark Wilkes has very little left to do. He's kind of like put out into left field. They recompense him for the fact that the end of his mandate is largely without any job to do. But he goes up to meet Napoleon twice, and he takes Laura and Madame Younghusband. They go together as his amanuenses, because despite the fact that he speaks Persian and Turkish, I believe, as well, Mark Wilkes doesn't speak French. So he very carefully gets his daughter and his Madame Younghusband as a chaperone, who of course is married, to come out to act as his amanuenses in his conversation with Napoleon. So they sit at a table and write down precisely what they're talking about. Interestingly, with all these conversations, notably with that with Littleton, but also that with Mark Wilkes, Napoleon tends to talk about the same things. He always talks about indigo, he talks about sugar beet, and he talks about pastel. Why does he talk about these things? Because these are things that are scientific advances that he himself brought to France. Indigo and sugar beet and pastel are all about trying to find local French produce to beat the continental blockade, because of course these things were products of the Caribbean and came via foreign trade, And that, of course, was no longer possible during the empire. So Napoleon tries to encourage the growth of pastel and indigo in France, notably in the southwest, and also sugar beet. And sugar beet, of course, becomes an invention that is used by the world over and takes away from sugar cane. So these are huge successes in his own mind. And so he's delighted to talk to people like Mark Wilkes, who, it must be said, is also very interested in chemistry, the big subject of the early 19th century. And so they talk about, notably, Sir Humphrey Davy. Sir Humphrey Davy is a personal friend of Mark Wilkes's. They have a correspondence in the end of the first decade of the 19th century. And Napoleon himself creates a prize for scientific endeavor, awards the prize to Sir Humphrey Davy in 1807, and Sir Humphrey Davy himself finally manages to come out and take the prize in 1813, which of course the countries have been at war throughout the whole period. Sir Humphrey Davy rather blots his copybook because he's pretty anti-French and can't wait to leave, but he does stay for 2 months and does receive his medal from the Institut, which of course was created by Napoleon. So yes, Mark Wilkes's account remains in manuscript at the British Library and has been used for the creation of the new version of that account. I'm going to go quickly now to take you to some new people. James Hall. James Hall comes from a dynasty of British naval men. His diary was published sort of in a kind of almost anonymous form as part of 3 naval biographies in the early 1920s. It has a fascinating account of 1818. James Hall was 33 years old when he was surgeon on HMS Favourite, which was stationed at Ascension, an island slightly to the north of St Helena, which was seized by the British at the time in order to prevent pirates or people trying to come to rescue Napoleon from settling on Ascension Island. Ascension Island is even more barren than St Helena, though St Helena does have some nice bits. So James Hall ends up at St Helena, becomes great friends with Barry O'Mara over a very brief period, just at the time when Barry O'Mara, Napoleon's Irish doctor, is being expelled from the island. And so James Hall is present for this great moment where Barry O'Mara says Hudson Lowe is trying to shorten Napoleon's life by depriving him of medical treatment. So this is a kind of key moment, and one of the main points of Barry O'Mara's diaries is he's trying to show Hudson Lowe in the worst possible light, because Hudson Lowe has basically made Barry O'Mara's life impossible. James Hall's diary suddenly emerges in the 1920s, and I've been in touch with descendants of James Hall, and they assure me that the family historian who created the book in the 1920s destroyed the family archives for some reason. So the original manuscript of this is gone. However, before the manuscript was destroyed, a French scholar managed to pick up the full version. And so it's the full version that was originally published in French, with my notes, which will be appearing in my book later on. I would like to bring you briefly, because we've got, let's say, 5 or 7 more minutes. I want to leave plenty of time for conversation and chat at the end of my talk. So I will move quickly here to Barry O'Mara. Barry O'Mara is perhaps the best known of all of the those who were in Napoleon's company during the time on St Helena. He was also the one, who wrote the longest memoirs. His memoirs run from 1816 through to 1818. So a big period of Napoleon's period in captivity. Why am I publishing this again? Well, because Barry O'Mara's notebooks, the notebooks from which he compiled his best-selling book that was published in 1823, An Exile, A Voice from St Helena, Napoleon in Exile. This book was created with a series of 19 notebooks. Now, the 19 notebooks were bequeathed to Joseph Bonaparte's factotum, a man called Maillard, who ended up living in America. I've tracked down the notebooks to the end of the 19th century, when the descendant of Maillard tried to sell them to Century Magazine. Century Magazine basically said, we don't want to buy them, but we will publish extracts if that's interesting to you. So they did publish these extracts long after the original publication of these Barry O'Mara's Memoirs of Napoleon. And so these much shorter, but very different texts, which include conversations with Napoleon, were never really published in and generally widely known. They've remained only in the version published by Century Magazine in 1900. So I have reproduced this with a series of an apparatus criticus explaining the remarks in the text. And this has been published. This will be published in French along with the rest of the stuff. So basically what this picture, if you like, is very rare. This is a picture that is held at the Museo Napoleonico in Rome and was made in 1832 when Barry O'Mara was working with John Stokoe, the doctor who was also banished from St Helena by Hudson Lowe. They were both working for Joseph Bonaparte, who was trying to put his son, the King of Rome, on the throne of France after the accession of Louis Philippe in 1830. So this sketch was made by Joseph Bonaparte's daughter, Charlotte, in 1832, of Barry O'Mara, who finally died 4 years later, having eaten too much and given too many after-dinner speeches. Apparently, he was very popular in the London salons in the 1830s. He was one of the principal figures of international Bonapartism, however, along with John Stokoe. So these are the people who are spreading the message of Napoleon that finally sets the scene for the accession of Napoleon III in 1848. So these are all brand new memoirs. There's a fine little picture. This is a lovely picture of, I'm just using this as a final picture because this is a memoir, a biography of Napoleon, which was published in 1815, which Napoleon gets a copy of. So Napoleon can read a British biography of himself on St Helena, and he has a conversation with Barry O'Mara about this book. So we have a fantastic intertextuality of Napoleon living his own life, reading biographies of his own life, and then discussing those with other English people who then talk about this on St Helena. This particular illustration, makes Napoleon laugh uproariously. He says, "Why have they made me ride through the Alps with a drawn sword? Do they think I'm trying to cut my way through the rocks?" was Napoleon's joke. So, I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. So another, perhaps more surprising feature about Napoleon is that we basically know almost everything about him. Some of his letters are even timed. So we have letters that were written at 10:10, letters that were written at 20:10, letters that were written at 10:30. It's almost like we're studying a figure of contemporary history where we might talk about texts or telegrams, whatever. We can date to the second. Barry O'Mara, for example, when he was expelled from Longwood on the 25th of July, 1818, we know that he left the soldiers who'd come to take him away from Longwood and march him down to the town at Jamestown. He left and spent 4 hours. We know precisely the time he left to go and see Napoleon and the time he left Napoleon to go with the soldiers to go down to Jamestown. So the amount of detail we have on Napoleon's life is quite extraordinary. So that I'd like to sort of finish where I've got about 3 more minutes. I think I'd like to conclude that basically the story of my research, the story of my work on Napoleon has turned, as I started to say at the beginning, has turned out to be quite a European endeavor. The archives are scattered in different languages throughout the world. The final part of my book is written by Hudson Lowe's secretary, a man called Gideon Gorica. He uses Italian an awful lot because he spent a part of his career in Sicily. So Barry O'Mara speaks fluent Italian. He quite often speaks Italian with Napoleon because Barry O'Mara's French isn't quite as good as his Italian in the beginning. So there's a really big European context to all the sources of Napoleon. We find Napoleon's manuscripts in Dresden. And just recently, last week, I discovered a completely unknown account of Napoleon on St Helena written in Russian. A famous Russian admiral who was captured by the Japanese. He's one of the first people to describe Japan to the West because he's in captivity in Japan. He did another tour of the world in 1817, 1819, and he ends up at St Helena. and he ends up being received by the Russian commissioner there on the island. And so we have his account, which is quite significant, 4 or 5 pages, which I have translated into French and will be published relatively soon. So Napoleon is a European figure, and eyewitness accounts reveal remarkable details about the emperor, but also those around him. Napoleon was and is a profoundly political subject. Conservative will emphasize Napoleon's dictatorial streak, whilst a more liberal approach will concentrate on Napoleon, the continuer of the French Revolution. Basically, the feud that leads to Barry O'Mara, the final person I talked about this evening, being expelled from St Helena, is largely to do with politics. Barry O'Mara's a bit on the left, and Hudson Lowe is a bit on the right. But however, with the fall of Napoleon's death, the end of the captivity, and the change of administration in London, when a left-wing administration came in, Hudson Lowe found himself part of the past. And the right-wing administration, Lord Liverpool, which had sustained him on his period in St Helena against all the attacks of the Liberals, was in fact to no avail, and he ended his career in slightly badly, didn't receive the promotions that he was expecting, whereas Barry O'Mara, with his bestseller was so successful that the police had to guide the people through the bookshop in case there was going to be a bit of a riot. So his book went into 5 different editions within 5 months. I think all I can say to that is I wish. So yes, Barry O'Mara was a huge success. Hudson Lowe ended up largely dying the pariah of the St Helena story. So left, right, it ends up being a political story. Napoleon is a political figure. Thank you very much.
Peter, that's an extraordinary story. Not being a historian, and certainly not a historian of Napoleon, I had no idea of all of this documentation that comes out of his time on St Helena. Absolutely fascinating. Now, I'm sure other people who have been looking at this would like to make comments and add. Tony, I leave it to you to manage this because I can't see everybody.
Yes.
But whoever would like to speak, don't forget to unmute your microphone, otherwise we can't hear you.
The best option is if you can put your question in the chat box so that we can then come to you when sort of in sequence, because as there are more than 25 people, we don't see everybody, so we can't necessarily see you waving to say, please, can I ask a question. We have one question in the chat box at the moment, and it's Brian Beeston, who has joined us from Southern California. And so I would like Brian to unmute himself and ask his question if he wishes.
Hi there. Excuse me. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Peter. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Napoleon's actual life on St Helena, and perhaps more about his demise. Was he actually poisoned? If so, how was he poisoned? And what do we know about his actual life and death there?
Okay, I'd just like to say I'm delighted you're from South California, because Maillard, the family Maillard, ended up in South California, which is where, if the Barry O'Mara's notebooks still exist, they could easily be in a university collection in South California. But I haven't managed to track them down. They probably don't exist anymore. But if they did exist anywhere, that's where they would be. Okay, Napoleon on St Helena. Napoleon on St Helena tries to live the life of a fallen monarch. He tries to keep the court life going. He has his entourage, which he considers as his court. There are 4 men and 2 women and some random children. And so he has formal dinners, which everybody has to go to. And they're generally pretty dull affairs. Only Napoleon talks, everyone else is kind of, Mrs. Younghusband gives a delightful description of just one of these dinners. And so it's kind of quiet. Sometimes he plays chess, sometimes he plays reversi. He always cheats, of course. But they know that he cheats. He knows that they know he cheats. So it's all it's all very knowing, and it's all just, it's kind of like, that's the way it is. he spends an awful lot of his time working. I mean, Napoleon famously is a king who works nights. So he's not a roi fainéant du tout. He's actually someone who's always working. He's obsessed with power. He's obsessed with doing stuff. So he doesn't stop on St Helena. Retirement for him is a catastrophe. So he spends his time, oddly, as the loser at Waterloo. He tries to write the history of his time. So usually losers don't get that chance. He gets 6 years in which to write the history of his time. So the Mémorial includes moments, my very best moments. Barry O'Mara gets conversations with Napoleon. It's like tape recordings, and he gets to talk about the Duc d'Enghien. He gets to talk about Waterloo. He gets to talk about the invasion of England. He said, no, Barry O'Mara says, did you really intend to invade England? And he says, yes. And then he gives all the details as to what he intended to do and how once he landed at Deal, it would have been a done deal because basically there were no hills between Deal and London. So, and had the cavalry been able to settle itself, had the time, it's true, there weren't really any major armies stopping Napoleon from getting to London. British had the idea that they would take the government to Worcester. They would do a Russia and move from, when the Russians, obviously, their government moved to St. Petersburg from Moscow. So we learn an awful lot about by Napoleon. He's defending himself. He's presenting his life as Napoleon, as a great person, Napoleon who was just trying to make things better, bring the advantages of the French Revolution. And that's what largely he's trying to show how badly treated he is so that he will be repatriated, and to show how he really was in the words of 1066 and all that, a good thing. So coming to his death, the most recent work on this is by a French doctor. I think basically nobody really of any people of any good sense, nobody really believes he was poisoned. The problem with the poisoning theory is that it isn't based on proper history. It's sort of like, I've decided that Napoleon's poisoned, and then you reverse engineer it to make it out that he's poisoned. So it's hard to get there from that. However, this new theory, which I find extremely compelling, it suggests that that Napoleon died of iron deficiency, that his blood had no iron left in it, anemia basically, and you can show this when you look at the post-mortem and also the symptoms that he has leading up to his death. So this is the most recent is in the catalogue to the exhibition Napoléon n'est plus, Napoleon is no more, which is currently on at the Musée des Invalides, Musée de l'Armée. It kind of makes sense. Basically, his body shuts down because he's got anemia. So that's the latest theory on Napoleon's death, and that people used to say that he died of cancer, but that apparently is not appropriate, largely because I think he's quite fat. People say in the last years that there's lots, that he has sort of wobbly cheeks, and he kind of moves in a kind of like fat way. So they think that the cancer theory is largely untenable, but the anemia is the most recent one and seems to be the one that most people accept.
So the high level.
Peter, excuse me. I have to leave you now because I have to go and take my grandson out. I'll leave you to carry on with talking to people. Tony, would you take over and thank you very much. It opened a new aspect of my knowledge of Napoleon. I should look into this more. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Terry.
Peter,
sorry, Brian, you were saying.
The next question is from our globe, as we're going around the globe. This is Scotland with a Manchester accent. So it's Ian Roberts, please.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tony. It's a bit of an aside, and I can see Alan Purvis is waiting to ask a question, and he's much more informed than me. But as you're a fellow Geodian, and our pal William Wordsworth was 250 last year, he went to the French Revolution, had a child, and was quite left-wing, but he became very anti-Napoleon and was cheering on Wellington at Waterloo. And Alan may know this, what happened, what was Wordsworth's connections with Napoleon, and why did he become so anti-Napoleon?
It's a very good question. I mean, Wordsworth, yes, they go up on Skiddaw and light a bonfire, don't they? And to say, great, we've saved England. Yeah, I mean, there are several figures like Wordsworth that take the journey of liberalism to conservatism. So he's going backwards. I mean, you could point to another example. An exact opposite journey would be, for example, to take Sir Robert Wilson, who is a figure who writes some of the most long-lasting criticisms of Napoleon, notably about the campaign in Egypt. Everybody still cites Robert Wilson's account of Napoleon in Egypt is still cited today as being the great war crimes of Napoleon. Robert Wilson in 1815 and 1816 goes completely the other way, and he becomes the total liberal. He even helps Lavalette, who is one of Napoleon's communications, it's a posh way of saying spy, but he's in charge of the post office, Lavalette. Lavalette is put in prison by the royal government after the second abdication, and Sir Robert Wilson, with some other characters in London, helps Lavalette escape from prison in Paris and from certain execution. And Robert Wilson is also hanging out with liberals in London, writing support of Napoleon. So people's political journeys, they all depend on, they're kind of personal in the end, and you can't really decide why somebody thinks Napoleon's a good thing or a bad thing. It's their own political journey. So yes, I think you can't really say why Wordsworth becomes a bit more right-wing, but he does, and therefore he hates Napoleon because Napoleon is the enemy of everything, is the Ancien Régime, whereas Napoleon presents himself as a sort of figurehead of the French Revolution. He wasn't, but he presents himself as that. And so liberals will use that as an argument, as a stick, to say, yeah, Ancien Régime, we want a Napoleon is a bit more liberal.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Peter Basile, if you would like to unmute.
That's a question.
Hi there. Hi there. Sorry about the delay. Hi. You mentioned Italy a few times, and you know, Napoleon's own link to that country. I was just wondering whether, you know, the various kingdoms or so on regions of Italy or Italians played any role or participated at all in that final phase of Napoleon's life.
Well, I think the most important, yes, Elba, of course, is the big moment. And I think the Elba episode is particularly relevant to Italy. And I think one of the most compelling reasons for saying why Napoleon is sent to Elba, now it's usually said that it's a special request from the Russian Tsar, Alexander, who is pretending that he's magnanimous. He's doing what Napoleon used to do. He's pretending to be Trajan. So Alexander is doing a Napoleon, being magnanimous, and says, right, I'm not going to exile you. I'm going to give you a kingdom. I'm going to give you a kingdom, and you can be your own king in your own territory, sovereign, which is what happens at the first abdication. He's not in exile. He's actually made king of somewhere else, sovereign of Elba. But what people forget in that this magnanimity of the Tsar giving Napoleon a kingdom, it's very, very close to Italy. And when you say Italy, you don't say Italy, you say Austria, because Italy is Austria's fief. What we call Italy today is made up of little bits, but most of it is Austrian influence. And so Austria and Russia don't necessarily see eye to eye in terms of international politics. Big empires, they're kind of slightly distrustful of each other. And so what Alexander, putting Napoleon on Elba, is saying, ha, I got you, Austria, because everybody thinks Napoleon's going to leave Elba for Italy. It's not so much people are surprised that Napoleon leaves Elba, but they're surprised he leaves Elba for France. And that creates the ground for Murat, of course, the great cavalry officer, who tries to reclaim his kingdom in Naples. And he even tries, he arrives, but Murat is no Napoleon. He doesn't set the ground. And of course, he ends up losing a battle at Tolentino, retreating to Naples. And then finally, the Austrians get him. And he's shot in Pizzo Calabro at the end of 1816, which Napoleon finds out on St Helena and goes, well, yeah, well, you had it coming, you weren't clever enough. Murat, of course, is Napoleon's sister's husband, and Napoleon's sister had a bit more of a statesman-like quality than Murat. Murat was very good as a cavalry officer, but less good as head of state. Not that Napoleon particularly liked Caroline. Caroline is probably the most disliked figure in the whole of the Napoleon family. Even Madame Mère, the mother of them all, didn't leave her any money in her will, imagining that she'd already had what she could get, and that was it.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
The next question, Alec Emmett, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That was a fantastic and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Just going back to the sort of the beginning of your story, what truth is there, or might there be, in the speculation that Napoleon was actually hoping to be taken off to the US into a sort of honourable retirement, and that he was well, fairly fundamentally shocked when the news came through that it was actually going to be sent to exile in St Helena?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Joseph Bonaparte is working in tandem with his brother. Napoleon abdicates for the second time. He tries to proclaim his son as the ruler of France. The provisory government of France, led by Fouché and Talleyrand, basically have nothing to do with that, saying that's not happening. So Napoleon is slowly pushed out of France by a sort of push-me-pull-you pursuit as he goes to Rochefort. And when he's at Rochefort, and he ends up on the Ile d'Aix, which is just off Rochefort, boats are prepared. And Joseph is going to the US as well. And so they're trying to get off. There's an idea that Joseph is going to provide Napoleon with a boat to go to America. So he does hum and ha about it. He does think about it. It's definitely a possibility. But I think I think most people accept these days that he is very conscious of his own dignity. And so he doesn't want to do anything which will prove undignified. And I don't think he really knows what how he will be received in the US. Joseph's okay, he can go as a private individual. Okay, he's ex-king of Spain and all the rest, but he can go as a private individual, and he does. He goes as the Count of Sevilliers. Everyone knows he's king, but you know, whatever. Napoleon is a different business, and so it's a bit more up in the air. And now he obviously weighs this up, and he goes like, do I, don't I? Is it going to work? He doesn't want to be captured on the sea, because that's undignified, that would be, and also it's not really very clear. So he thinks, possibly, you know, maybe my best call is to hand myself over. He can't be caught by the Prussians because they're not going to give him anything. He can't stay in France because the royalists aren't going to keep him either. Maybe there's talk of a trial, maybe there's talk of execution. It's really hard to tell. And you can't imagine maybe that any of these people really want to do that, but there's talk of it. And then, so Napoleon thinks, does he, doesn't he? And then he goes, okay, right, I'm going to hand myself over. And he hopes that maybe it can be another Elba. I mean, it's pie in the sky. I mean, I don't know why he thinks it's even remotely possible, but certainly the issue of what to do with Napoleon, which was decided by the Congress of Vienna before the Battle of Waterloo, he's already the outlaw of Europe. And they talked already about St Helena, apparently. They talk about it. It's not entirely clear. There's rumors. Blah, blah, blah. People think that St Helena is a bit like you know, Papillon. It's a bit like a penal colony. It's not that bad. It's really not a place where you send somebody to the guillotine sèche. It's actually quite okay. It's close to the Tropic of Capricorn, so it's quite hot in the summer. It's never very cold. It's quite damp. Lots of rats, but that's the way it is. You know, everybody has that problem. Termites maybe too, but it's not Guyana. It really isn't Guyana. So he's surprised by St Helena. All of his reactions are political. So you have to remember that obviously every reaction is an argument. Every reaction is his health is an argument. His health is political. And so that's one of the reasons why the governor, who's not very mentally agile, doesn't do that. It's because Napoleon's very, very quick, even as he gets iller, and he starts off with quite a lot of native savvy. And now he knows how to present himself. So everything he says has that political edge, and it's getting me back to Europe. Everything's getting back to Europe. So when we, as I said in my talk, when you get to 1818 in the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, and they said, yeah, we're leaving him there, that's like, ka-ching, the shutters come down, and he realizes that, yeah, it's not going to happen. And then he does get actually a lot iller, and then finally dies. So it doesn't really answer your question about America, but I think he did try, didn't do it. Joseph does, makes a massive success about it. His house, I've discovered that his house is the second biggest house in the US at the time. It's huge. He lives at Point Breeze. He has a collection of Spanish paintings that is better than any American collection at the time. People just want to go to his house to see his thing. It's huge. He's got a sort of Versailles just down the river from what was then the American capital, which of course was Philadelphia. So on a swift boat with the tide going in the right direction, he's right down in the center of American politics. So yeah, Joseph makes a big success of it.
Fascinating, thank you.
Okay, Alan Purvis has a question.
As I've mentioned, Stokoe, one of Napoleon's surgeons, at one point the theory is that Napoleon had hepatitis. I don't know how that chimes in with the later theories, and is there any other evidence of that being a possibility?
Yes, the political illness. Hepatitis is the disease of the tropics. Now, if you have the disease of the tropics, the only way to get out of that is to get you off the island, right? So that's one of the reasons why they suggest he has hepatitis. They may well have thought he had hepatitis. Napoleon's delighted they think he has hepatitis, because also when he's ill and he's got hepatitis, keeping him on St Helena is a death sentence. And so, you're killing me if you keep me on St Helena with hepatitis. And so Hudson Lowe cannot allow Napoleon to have hepatitis. It's impossible, because that will be so bad for him. So Barry O'Mara says he's got hepatitis. Stokoe says he's got hepatitis. What's really interesting, actually, the memoirs of Hall, the guy, James Hall, he reveals in his memoirs that people didn't know before that Stokoe, O'Mara, and Hall all had a little job thing. So when Barry O'Mara was kicked out, Stokoe would take O'Mara's job at Longwood, and Hall would take Stokoe's job on Conqueror, and we'd all end up happy. So they weren't actually as innocent as they made out. That Hudson Lowe also was probably playing them a bit too. So politics and local politics, it's all very small and happening, but so he can't have hepatitis. And when we get to the death and the what's it called, the post-mortem, one of the doctors famously tries to say, and the liver was slightly enlarged, which Hudson Lowe blows a gasket and says, that's not happening, we're taking that out of the post-mortem report. And then the Corsican doctor Antommarchi refuses to sign because they're trying to say that he died of hepatitis. He doesn't die of hepatitis. He dies of an excessive dose of calomel, which is basically to make him regular. But unfortunately, they give him 10 times the dose, and he's not got enough. Basically, there's not enough iron in his body to cope with that, and so basically causes his body to shut down after emptying itself. So yeah, it's a not very pleasant death, but probably not poison. I mean, what did actually kill him was the calomel. So if anybody was medical malpractice or the state of medicine at the time, the anemia hadn't been recognized, was not a recognized disease at the time. That's one of the reasons why they didn't spot it.
Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of the questions in the chat room. Does anybody else have one? Ian.
Thank you, Tony. Hello.
Hello.
I'm intrigued, and this may be a naive question, by Napoleon writing his will very shortly before his death. did he really expect the terms of what he wrote to be respected, and under what legal regime? And indeed, have you read it, or what happened to it?
Yes, the will is, because it's written on St Helena, which is technically belongs to the East India Company, the legal regime is British. And so it is signed and finished off in Canterbury. So it's published in English originally, eventually in 1823, and it's finally, the executors are all his companions on St Helena. He did have a certain amount of money. He over-eggs his cake as to how much money he actually had. And this rather puts Napoleon III in a bit of a difficult situation, because obviously Louis Philippe is never going to execute Napoleon's will. That's not happening. But once Napoleon III comes to power, it's obviously in his interests, because he's built his regime on the idea of the first Napoleon. So he does take it upon him to execute the will with the funds that were available. And so not everybody receives 100% of what they've been bequeathed, but they do receive a pretty large amount. And as for the towns that were suffered in the invasion of the Allies, and as for all of the soldiers of the Grande Armée, what they do is they come up with a brilliant solution. It's called the Médaille de Sainte Hélène, the St Helena medal, which those veterans who are still alive at the time get a medal and a certificate. And that's the execution of Napoleon's will, the final bit. So it's almost there, but some of the money that he thought he had, he didn't. And others of the money, he's trying to suggest that France should use it, which of course, there's no political will in France for that to happen, so it doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. And a lovely talk, most fascinating.
Thank you.
You can go on forever listening.
Yes, no, indeed. And I do actually have to go in a minute. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, but I have to, yes, I have to nip off.
So, can you take a last question if there is one?
Yeah, I can take one more. I've got 4 minutes before I have to go.
Anybody have a last question?
Yeah, just a quick one. I don't read French. When are you publishing in English?
I know it has been said to me before, but I mean, I don't know. I've lived and worked here for the last 30 years, and I'm starting to publish more and more in French and less in English. I don't know. What's really interesting is the way that the pendulum has swung completely the other way. All the publications on St Helena in 1915, 1921 were all in English. The Times had a special supplement, a special free supplement that they gave out on the 5th of May, 1921, with a 60-page articles by great historians of the period of, talking about Napoleon. Foch made a special article about it as well. So those huge British thing about Napoleon in 1921. In 2021, all the publications have largely been French. And so this started with the publication of the discovery in England of Las Cases Mémorial, but also we've had a republication, unfortunately not a very good version, but I mean, you do. Gorgo's memoirs have been republished. It's pretty poor, but anyway, whatever. Don't get me started on that subject. Then we've also got the last years of the Grand Marshal Bertrand, as also his memoirs have just come out. That's a much better book. And Thierry Lentz, my colleague Pierre Branda, has written a nice, lovely, big volume of Napoleon on St Helena, which is a sort of discussion of the period. And he's also published some of the lesser known texts that Napoleon dictated there. I'm very pleased. One of them, he didn't do this, which is a shame, but one of them exists only in English. So it's as if Napoleon, one of his last dictated texts was only in English. It's called The Letters of a Store Captain. And it's saying, to show how badly I'm being treated on St Helena. But the French version of that, which published in 1821, was translated from the English version. So whatever happened to the French, I have no idea. Barry O'Mara had a hand in it, of course, as usual. He's always there somewhere, helping out, doing stuff, doing his Bonaparte thing. He was, as they said at the time, he was charmed and seduced by the great man and totally devoted to him, and remained as such up until his death in 1836. So yes, I'm afraid that the bad news is, got to learn French.
Well, I was just thinking, Tony's Tony's got nothing better to do. He could translate it for you.
Absolutely, yeah. Tony, there you go. Good job for you.
Well, thank you for that offer of employment. And above all, thank you to Peter for that. Your enthusiasm for the topic is absolutely fabulous and makes it even more enjoyable for us all. And I'm sure everybody has had a great time. Just to let everybody know, the talk has been recorded. And so for those who, one or two of you who came in partway through, you will be able to go to our YouTube channel from the end of the day tomorrow and listen to it all again, if you wish. So thanks again, Peter, and good luck with your next engagement. And
thank you very much.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.